Okay, so back to this. All right. So so we got through behaviorism. And so now the thing that we should know about behaviorism and Freud's psychoanalysis and even his post-Freud's is these are what are known as deterministic theories, which mean that you don't really have control over your behaviors. In psychoanalysis, it's your unconscious that drives your behaviors and your emotions. In behaviorism, it is your series of rewards and punishments and conditioning that put you where you are. So, if we were to put terms in Freudian, you're not here in college because you chose so. You're here because it's satisfying somehow your unconscious drives. Or if we put it in behavioral terms, you were rewarded and conditioned in very complex ways to be here, but it really wasn't because you have the motivation and the desire or whatever it is. What the behaviorists would argue is motivation and those things are just psychological byproducts of stimuluses and responses in the environment. That even consciousness, I think it's B.F. Skinner said, is just a byproduct of our conditioning world. So, as you could probably imagine, a lot of psychologists, especially those in the clinical field, kind of were like, but people can change and they can choose to change. But they really didn't have a philosophical grounding or scientific grounding to do so. So, the next kind of evolution in psychology is to bring back things like free will, motivation, conscious decisions, and those kinds of things. And that's going to start with what's known as the humanistic approach. And the two kind of people for this one are Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. But to kind of give you, if you'll notice the date in this, it's 1950. What was going on in 1950? Well, we just got through two world wars. We were in conflicts in other areas of the world. We were in the midst of a startup of the Cold War. When I was young, we used to do drills about nuclear bombs and getting under our desks, thinking that that would save us. In my very young years, growing up, and so this was a time where the world just looked like, hell in a handbag, and no one really knew what the next day was going to bring. And on a kind of a philosophical level, there was a philosophy that really started to connect with people called existentialism. Existentialism, in its most basic forms, is this idea that we're born into a meaningless, chaotic existence. That unlike what religion provides or what others philosophies of life would provide, um, existential theory really feels like we're born out of no purpose, no existence. And the purpose of our consciousness and who we are is to make purpose. So humans develop things like religion, government, schools, trade systems, all to make some type of meaning out of a meaningless life. Okay. Now, why is this important? This idea of building out of nothing and everything else. Well, this was more scientific evidence that we do have something called free will. We can choose our fate if we're born into nothingness and chaos. We can choose who we want to become because there's no higher power telling us what we need to or not need to do. So we truly have this thing called free will. And this is really the basis of humanistic theory. Because what do we do with this free will? Well, we're motivated to be the best that we can be, to have an understanding of why we're here and why we exist. Why do we build institutions if life is meaningless? And it's really because we give life meaning on kind of the existential end. Okay. So we have this development now, what's known as a humanistic approach, which suggests that what motivates people is to understand who they are as a human being and the problems that people face are obstacles that prevent them from knowing this. So, things like unemployment, relationship issues, um, getting off the path to things like addiction and those things, and mental health issues. All of those things prevent us or slow our journey from understanding who we are as a complete person. So, the first person to talk about this, and this is just a quick overload, is Abraham Maslow, which I'm willing to bet the majority of everyone in this class has heard of the pyramid of needs. That looks more like a rock of needs, but use your imagination. And what he believed is people have some needs they have to achieve and have before they can reach the pinnacle to become a self-actualized person. Okay. So we have to have, for example, our biological needs met, warmth, food, water, health, physical health, safety needs would be the next one. And we'll go over these in more detail later. Relationship needs, and then self-emotional, psychological needs. And when we have these all in place, we now have the potential to become self-actualized. Okay. Now, I mentioned that these guys were therapists and stuff. If you think about this, if you're going into social work, counseling, or therapy, these are the things that we assess when a client comes into our office. So, usually on the questionnaires, there's something about their physical health. Do they have stable housing? Do they have stable food sources and income? And then we go, do they live in a safe place? Is there violence in the home? Is there gang affiliation, for example? Is it a high crime area they live in? And then we get into what is their social support system? What is their relationships like with their friends and intimate partners and family? And then we look at their emotional needs of how do they feel about themselves? What is their self-esteem? Are they depressed? Are they anxious? And all of those build our assessment to try and determine what can be done to help that person with their given problem. Okay. Now, the definition of self-actualization that I prefer to use is that of Carl Rogers, who added to the humanistic theory by bringing up the notion of what's known as the ideal self versus the real self. Okay, and the ideal self is that person we think we ought to be. That is the best parent, mother of the year, employee of the year, 4.0 student, um, I don't know, things that we might not be now. Social influencer. I'll try to use some modern terms. Social influencer. Those kinds of things that superstar, rock star, those things that we think we should be or we deserve to be in our mindset. The real self is the person that exists here and now. This is a person who has flaws. This is the person that has good qualities. This is the person that doesn't do so good with some things, but good with others. It's the one that exists right here and right now. And what Carl Rogers argued is a self-actualized person is when the real self and the imagined self are one and the same. Now, this doesn't mean we become the superstar or the mother, father of the year or the 4.0 student. No, it means that that is who we want to be, is us, who we are as a genuine human being. And it means that an actualized person is someone who accepts all their flaws and accepts all of their qualities, and they accept that all of that is part of who they are, and that allows them to work on their flaws and their problems. That allows them to work on their qualities and use those as good coping skills, as an example. Okay. But if you can imagine, there's probably very few people who actually get to this level. This week we celebrated maybe one of them, Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, I think would maybe be on that list, because having complete acceptance for one person also means that you exist with no biases or prejudices, because a person who accepts themselves completely, according to the humanistic philosophy, also accepts other people completely for their flaws, their problems, their issues. So they're able to look at people who might have deep flaws, but also see their humanity without bias and prejudice because of their acceptance for themselves. So high mark to achieve, but that's kind of the journey that a humanistic approach kind of goes for. What I would summarize for this right now is that we are all on a journey in our psychological and behavioral worlds, and that we all want to know who we are and we have a motivation to do so. But when things aren't right in all of our world, in our psychological, social, and safety and biological worlds, it's very hard to focus on those. They become barriers for us to achieve those kinds of understandings. Okay. But the main thing I want you to note about humanistic theory is it brings back the notion of motivation and humans' ability to make their destination what it is. And we're not just a product of reward and punishment and a product of our initial unconscious drives. Okay. All right. So those were some starting theories. Let's go through some more movements that we'll go over within this semester. Okay. These two started in about the 1900s, and they're very active today in the present. The first one is social psychology. The second one is developmental psychology, probably more appropriately named today as human growth and development or lifespan psychology. But what social psychology adds to our understanding of the human condition is, how does the situation a person is in influence their behavior? And this is known as situationalism. And it's the argument that a person's situation is a better determinant of behavior than a person's beliefs, values, and ideas and morals, even. And I'm just going to leave this at this, that the world is an important influencer on her, and we will see later in the course with social psychology how people can be, by the situation, make them do things counter to their moral fortitude, counter to their beliefs about violence, just merely by changing minute things within the situation. We can even influence if someone will probably help someone else or not, and it won't be based at all on their moral beliefs about helping others at all. And so the situation is a powerful force for our behavior. And we'll talk more about that and those kinds of things that can create that when we get to social psychology. Human growth and development, or developmental psychology, is the notion that people change cognitively, social, and biological over time, and that we go through certain life stages that provide us with the opportunity to develop in any of these domains. Okay. So we'll see that there's a prime period in life to develop things like language is a really good example. But we'll see that there are periods of life that are ultimate for humans at certain times. Interestingly, we will find, for example, when we get to human growth and development, that we're actually more healthy in our 30s than we are in our 20s. We're cognitively more wise in our mid 40s to mid 50s than we are in our adolescence, teen years, young adulthood, and in up to middle adulthood up to the age of 45. And we'll find that there are some very unique wisdoms into late adulthood, and it's all due to how these three dynamic forces, our psychological world, our social world, and our biological world, intermix with each other. So that's going to be an important part of the story that we tell. The second one started in the 1960s when behaviorism was broken. We'll get into that story later, but we went through something called the cognitive revolution, where luckily what we did is we took the experimental methods of behaviorism and started to apply them to mental processes again. So this is where we're going to come up with our models of memory, where we're going to understand how memory works. This is where we get our notions of decision making and how decision making processes work and the like. So this will become an area that kind of fills in that gap between a stimulus in the environment and behavior, and why human beings are not so predictable. We're not a pigeon and we're not a rat in a maze. We make decisions that sometimes are either more beneficial or less beneficial for our well-being. And then the last kind of area that will have an influence on our conversation through the rest of the semester is the biological approach, which really started in the 1980s with what were really primitive MRI scanning machines, where we could actually peer into the brain and see what areas are active when a person is committing some type of behavior or mental process. And we could really see kind of what the brain does when certain things happen. And I'm going to leave the importance of this to this short story because we'll talk a lot more about it next week when we get into biological psychology. But it has had some really major influences on the way we think about psychological processes. Within my field, I think of studies of love and intimate love. Okay. And I'll use this story and then we'll move on a little bit. Is in the if you look at early theories and theories on love, they're all emotion based. They're all based on the feelings and emotions that we have when we're in love with someone. And so some scientists wanted to see, okay, so if that is the case, what areas of the brain are active when someone is thinking about the person they're in love with? Um, and also, what are the areas of the brain when a person loses a love? So these were the questions. Both are supposed to be emotions. So the area of the brain that you would expect to light up is in the mid area of the limbic system, mainly a little part of the brain called the amygdala, which is really at this point, we'll call it the primary emotion response area that responds to pretty much all of our emotional experiences. Okay. And so when we put people in this MRI machine, we said, oh, that's going to be the area. And we were completely wrong. Um, when you're thinking about someone you're deeply in love with, or if I show you pictures of someone you're in love with versus neutral pictures, it's interesting. The area of the brain that lights up is probably the most basic more primitive, but probably really important area of the brain, and that's areas within the brain stem, the area between our brain and our spinal cord. This area of the brain also controls hunger, thirst, breathing, heart rate, um, any other autonomic biological process that keeps the body running and us surviving. That's the area of the brain that lights up when you're in love with someone. And so, for that, over the last 25 years, we have had to change our models of love from an emotion base to a basic biological drive that we have as human beings. Now, why do we call this a basic biological drive? Let's look at the other end. What happens when you break up with someone? When you lose a love, well, it's not the emotion areas of the brain that fire then either. It's actually the physical brain area. It's the physical pain areas of the brain, the dopaminergic areas of opioid areas of the brain that start to fire when you lose someone. Meaning, based on what we've learned from neurology, there's really no difference between having a chronic an illness, a physical illness, a broken leg, a cut on the arm, and losing someone. It's all the same to the brain. And so that has had to make us change our ideas about what happens when we lose someone in our world. That it is something that the body is experiencing as a physical damage. Okay. And so we'll get into more of this as we move through the semester because what we've learned from the brain really has changed some of the models and ideas we think about when it comes to different concepts, even things like falling in love with someone and losing that love eventually. So, something to kind of think about. But that's been the influence of biological approaches. But we will also see that it is really still in its infancy. There's a lot of things we don't know, and we have a lot of areas to understand. So I'll leave that at that, though. Okay. Um, Let me think. What time are we at? What I want to do, I'm going to come back to this on Monday. But I think this would be the best place to kind of stop for today, is I just want to mention that in modern psychology, if you can kind of guess, after we've went through all of these different models, modern psychology, and this is how we will approach the rest of this class, see all of these processes that we've talked about separately and in their own separate fields as a dynamic interaction. Okay. So from here on out throughout the course, we're going to talk about how our psychological world, the way we think about our world, the way we process our world, influences behavior and mental processes. And we're going to see them as equally important as basic biological processes. What is happening physically in the brain and the neurochemicals that are involved? And how do those interplay with under our psychological and social world? And that's the last component that we will talk about in each of our topic areas is how do our social interactions really influence then again our behavior and how we act and how we behave and how we interpret our world. So that's going to be the goal. But you know what? I've done a lot of talking tonight, and uh, uh, w- so I think this is where what we'll do on Monday. On Monday, we will kind of finish up with some of these. You know, we've been talking a lot about these individuals that really did this, but that's not the whole story of psychology. It's taken women and people who have marginalized groups who have really contributed to the field a lot. So we're going to go over women in psychology, psychologists from marginalized view, and we'll look at the growing field of what's known as Native American, also known as indigenous psychology, and we'll see kind of how these different approaches and these different influences really have made it so that the field is more dynamic and more growing. But I think let's leave that for Monday, and then we'll get into the biological area, which will be less of me talking. How does that sound to everybody? So I am going to